But a lot of what I'm doing this evening is based on the first of the two books, the Handbook of British Birds, which I'll be showing you as extracts from, as I've done before, and a lot of it's brought into the RSPB Birds, Their Hidden World. But I was just thinking as I put that slide up that you think that writing a book involves starting at word one and working your way through until you finish, and it doesn't. When publishers ask you to do a book, they say you've got to fill 360 pages and no more, no less, no more words, no more less, and it becomes a jigsaw to fit it all in. A little bit like my challenge tonight, where Alison said, you've got an hour, 7 species, no trouble. So my books tend to be packed full of facts, not much grammar, lots of facts, seeing how much you can get into the space available. And I think this evening is going to be a bit like that. So no more to do. We'll get into the first of the species we've selected, which is a very good species for London, which is mute swan, starting on a cold January day when the swan, or perhaps even February, when the swans are just starting to display. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. This is an extract from the handbook, but I just wanted to show you, because now we put a grid showing all interesting facts about them. What I wanted to show you was this is an amber species. This is a species that isn't red and it isn't green. It's recovering from a previous decline, and it's coming out at the other end at the moment. And I'll show you more on that in a minute. It only can fit in. It's a big bird. It only has one brood a year. But what's interesting, if you look at the maximum age, I'm always fascinated by longevity of birds. There are records of birds that lived quite old age, and the oldest one so far is around about 29 years. This is a typical mute swan, of course. This is a male on the edge of a nest, helping with nest building. Other swans, of course, in Britain are whooper swan, with a much straighter neck and a yellow and black bill. Buick swan. Hope you can see that. All right, I've got a caption over the top of mine. That's better. Also with a yellow and black bill, but a much smaller bird and a shorter neck. And if you want to see the wings, there we are. The two side by side, look at the bill patterns. You can see the whooper swan on the left has a much more elongated yellow patch than the Buick swan on the right hand side, so a chance to see the difference. Mute swans are big birds. They have trouble getting into the air. They often get caught up in London streets, holding up the traffic, literally because they can't take off. They need a big run up to do it, and preferably on water. And but once in the air, they're quite distinctive, because of the 3 swans, they're the ones you can hear their wings. And a little recording of that here. Actually, are scarily loud. Of course, hoopers and buicks are noisy in the air, but that's with their trumpeting. Their wings don't seem to make nearly as much noise as mute swans. Habitats for mute swan, well, you probably know this. It's lakes, it's rivers, and it can be estuaries. You can see mute swans on the sea, sometimes in quite large numbers, particularly around estuaries where there's good feeding. And so this is a sort of common view of a family of mute swans. Little anecdote here, that way back in my lecturing career, somebody asked me at one lecture, why do swans always have an uneven number of cygnets? And I said, rubbish. No, I didn't quite. I've put it more politely than that. And you know, every time I take a photograph, I seem to end up with an odd number of swans. It can only be a coincidence. Feeding methods. Well, there's a lot to be said in the adaptation of mute swan, because they have a very long neck. You know that, of course. They feed by upending. I've got a picture I should have shown you. You can imagine that. They can stretch down a long way under the water using the neck and upending, and they can pull and tear at the plants much deeper down than other waterfowl can reach, and the geese. So they're feeding in a totally different zone of a lake than say, the geese or the ducks. And they're filtering, as the other wildfowl do, through their bills. And in the process, they often take up grit from the bottoms of streams and rivers and lakes into their gizzard, and that helps digest, that helps sort of grind up the food as part of the digestion process. And so this is a typical view of a mute swan feeding on a typical lake, a bit of reed around it, and there it's using its neck, and you can imagine that neck can go down pretty deep into the water to get at food. They're very aggressive, of course, to other birds. They're monogamous, so that once they take a long time to mature, I'll talk more about that in a minute, but when they are mature, they do tend to mainly have one mate for life. If one dies, they may well take on another mate, but one pair will defend an area quite regularly and from year to year, and in the process become quite aggressive to other birds in the areas. And this are two males having a standoff. And you're probably familiar with this very aggressive position and posturing of a mute swan on territory, and we'll see that very soon. Well, probably about now they'll have eggs with nests in them, sorry, even the nests with eggs in them, and be very territorial around about. What you do see, and perhaps not so much in London, but out more into the country, and always find it in odd places, you do get herds of non-breeding swans. This is right out by the Ouse washes, and when I saw this, I thought these were going to be hooper swans, but most of them, if not all, are actually mute swans. And they were there, well, that's in winter, but it's definitely a wintering herd of swans. But you get it in towns as well. This is the river in Bedford, and there's a herd of swans there all year round. And what you think of other places that have this sort of gathering, Stratford-on-Avon, and Henley and Windsor. Look at several places along the Thames, and there must be places within London that I should know and can't think of. Twickenham, Richmond and Twickenham, it comes to mind as probably very likely. And these, if you look at them closely, these are non-breeding birds. Their bills are never as orange, deep orange, as the adult male that I showed you right at the beginning. And these are immatures. They've lost their brown feathers, they're white, but they haven't got, they're not, well, I say the bill colour is different, and they take about 5 years to reach maturity. And only when they reach maturity will they start to breed. Well, something you might spot with swans if you go to somewhere like the Wetland Centre or any of the gravel pits where you can see them, Rainham and so on, is something called commensal feeding, which is a scientific name for something that the birds do sometimes, if you recognise it. And this is a lake near my house, actually, in the middle of winter, frosty January morning, February morning, and there were young juvenile swans of the previous year busy feeding. There's a little flock in the middle. Perhaps it was a wintering herd, I'm not quite sure. But what they've done is other birds have gathered round them as they're feeding. And the commensal bit is that the other birds are benefiting from the rather wasteful feeding of the juvenile swans. So they're tugging up weed from the bottom, the weed is floating away, and that's providing food for these other birds. Courtship in swans starts very early in the year, can be end of January and certainly February, and round about Valentine's Day you can see the swans come together and make a typical heart shape, very, very, very romantic. I'm sure they don't realise that, but that's the typical display of mute swans before copulating. After that, of course, you get females on the nest. This is female. The males help build the nest and are very much on guard round it, passing the nest material to the female on top, and she builds the nest to match her diameters, so she gets a nice cozy nest. And then you end up with a brood of young duckling goslings. Stop even calling them cygnets. Cygnets in a few weeks from now, and spot another uneven number of cygnets. Oh, and another uneven number of cygnets on the embankment of Bedford River as they get bigger, and they stay together as a family for quite until into the autumn. So not unusual to see this, and both parents very good at guarding their offspring, staying together as a family. Much better parents than say mallard are, which seem to have a death wish for their juveniles. Distribution and migration, well, if you look at the birds of Western Palearctic, you find that mute swans are actually spread most across Europe, but also across into Asia, and in parts of that, the orangey tangerine colour, they are migratory. So some parts of the world they're migratory, but in Britain they are sedentary. Don't go very far. Conservation, well, population, I said, had been way down, had big crisis in the 1960s, early 70s. A lot of swans were ingesting lead, suffering from lead poisoning. there were bans on various fishing tackles, particularly that had lead within them. Voluntary ban seemed to be quite successful, and since then the population has been on the increase again. So it's a good news story. I'm surprised it's still an amber species, quite honestly. Cultural links, I like to throw a few cultural links into my birds. Well, I can't go into swan song very much, but it's surprising how much that's passed into the language. And is it a myth? Is it truth? You have to read the books. You can't make up your mind. If you blow through the bone of a dead swan, it will make a noise. But whether that's the origin of swan song, I'm not at all convinced. Swan maidens turn up in all sorts of stories and ballets, fables and myths and legends, of course. Swans in music, you can make a private challenge to find swans in music. Swan and Tuonela, of course, but of course, if we had more time, I'll be playing you this hymn to the swans from Sibelius's Fifth Symphony, which is magnificent and really does capture the sound. But actually, that's not mute swan, that's hooper swans. Swans as food, of course, they were food. Come to that in a moment. And swan upping is part of that. And I was mandated to, to mention swan upping, of course, because I'm talking to a London audience. Swans as food, worth following through. 1465, we found a record of the investiture of the Archbishop of York. I'm sure you remember it. On the menu were 400 swans, and just as a matter of interest, and it will come up later on this evening, 204 bitterns. I think there are other things as well. I've just picked those two off because they were interesting. Protection in Britain is interesting. So it is a protected species. This royal thing is correct. They've always, going way back into history, they were prized as a delicacy at banquets. The kings asserted legal ownership of swans from the 12th century. So it goes back a long way. Henry IV, laws of that period said only a man earning 5 marks or more could own his own swans. So that limited the number of owners there could be. By Henry VII's time, there was a year's imprisonment or a big fine for taking eggs of swans. And by Elizabeth I's reign, there was a master of swans, which was a royal office. But there were, at that time, 900 other legal owners, as well as the crown. Today, they are royal owned, or they come under the royal ownership, but there is only the Worshipful Company of Dyers and Vintners who also have the right of ownership, and it's the marking of those swans, which is the ceremony of swan upping, which if you read the literature, which I did just scan it today to remind myself what they're saying it's doing much more to check on the health and well-being of the swan population on the Thames. It isn't a catch them and mark them and fling them back sort of thing. There is some sort of scientific study going on as well, but there's still quite a paraphernalia. So swans, we must chase on, no time for breath, onto skylarks. Not quite so much to say about skylark, but must be one of our many favourite birds. And a little bit from the book, one thing to notice straight away, we're dealing here with a red data species. This is one that is, unlike the mute swan, in marked decline. Some things to notice that they can actually have up to 4 broods a year and 3 or 4 eggs at a time. So they should be quite productive. And again, I always like longevity on species. There has been at least one found to reach 10 years old. So although many will not make that, of course, that is a maximum ever, but nevertheless, it is a maximum so far. There might even be older than that. It's one of the little brown birds of the countryside, as are meadow pipits. We're not talking about meadow pipits, but I just wanted to throw one in. Another brown bird of the countryside in the same habitat is corn bunting. And we're not going to talk about corn buntings either, but again, I wanted to throw that in because they can get confused with skylark. Well, they're just little brown birds of the countryside, aren't they? But the thing that skylark has of its own, of course, is its song. Hard to photograph skylarks in flight, or it is for me with my camera. So a few very bad pictures of skylark in flight. But I was quite pleased with this series. That one to me is absolutely typical hovering flight. Although it's not sharp, a really disgraceful picture, it actually captures the jizz of the bird as you might see it over the fields. Here's another one hovering, not quite so obvious in the same position, but tail span, wings spread, hovering over, not actually hovering, but flying in quite small, tight circles, gliding more over its own territory, going up higher, getting up to about 200 feet high, almost disappearing from view. And then when they get to a height and start to want to come down, they still carry on singing for a way. And then this is why I quite like this series of pictures. They drop. This one, they sort of close their wings and they tumble down. And some of the descent, when you see it in frame frozen mode, looks quite scary. It's straight down. No wonder they stop singing when they get to this sort of position, and then they land back in their territory. If we look at a skylark, yes, it's a little brown bird, not much to distinguish it really, paler underneath, brown flecks on the top, the suggestion of a little crest. But looking at them, and I've photographed them quite a bit, and they're in their habitat, they just disappear. I love the camouflage of this particular one. It's all there to see apart from the tail, but nevertheless, it's well camouflaged in this vegetation. If it flies, it is more distinctive, I think, because it's got two things. They're bigger than you often imagine. They're not a tiny bird. They're not quite the biggest of starling, but getting there. But they've got pale fringes to the tips of their wings. The rear edge of the wing sort of has a pale fringe to it. Can you see that? That shows up quite well in flight, as do the two outer tail feathers, sort of dark outer tail feathers, but the absolute edge of the tail is white and or very pale grey. And those two features always clinch skylark, and I tend to be better at identifying them flying away from me than perhaps coming towards you. The voice, we heard that just now. A little bit. I looked up a few things about this. It's a very good book on the life of the skylark and in the Poyser series. Song flight is an opportunity to broadcast widely over open, sparsely populated countryside. So where there are no perches, the skylark really scores because it can obviously go up to a height and doesn't need a tree or a bush or a post to sing from. It also, from up there, has an advantage of being able to see and observe its neighbours. So you can keep an eye on what they're up to and whether your female has got to. Males are keen to prevent both infidelity and to look for opportunities to mate with other females. As we know these days, very few birds are totally monogamous, because the small ones, mute swans, are very much an exception. And it's not unusual for female skylarks to stray into another territory. But of course, from up high, the males have an eye on this and can come down pretty fast if they need to, and declare and defend their territory. It's been thought that actually song flights, which can go on for up to half an hour, may actually be indicators to the females of male's fitness. In other words, the fitter the male, the longer it will sing more, the easier it will stay up there, the higher it will go, the louder the song. All those sort of things may well be indicators to a female that this is a particularly fit and robust and appropriate male with genes that are probably worth passing on to your offspring. And song flights averaged about 4 minutes each, but they have gone over 30 minutes. So I think 20 minutes is quite common for a long one, and over 30 has been recorded. And the other thing with skylark song, it has been studied back in the 1950s quite accurately. When they first got bird recordings and were able to analyze them properly, and they found there were regional dialects. Now, this isn't common just to skylark, it's common to other species as well, but skylarks were the ones that were studied from quite early on, and they found that there were different dialects, subtle differences in the song over Britain, and certainly once you got into Europe, perhaps not surprisingly, they sounded, at least to skylarks, a bit different. We would only see the difference if we slowed them down and put them perhaps through a computer. Distribution in Britain, well spread out. Almost everywhere except the very highest ground. In winter, moving away from the high ground, much more common in the lowland areas, and we get an influx to the continent because they're right across Europe, right across Asia, and in the northern part they migrate south for the winter. Our British ones are probably resident, but we get a big influx of continental ones adding to our population. In the past, we probably got very many more. Habitat, of course, is just typical open countryside, can be pasture, can be arable, but there are places where they are disappearing very fast. The diet is plant material such as grain, leaves, things. Plants include nettle and dock. Vertebrates they also use. I'll put a few up there. I won't go through them all, but they are taking small, we would call them insects, but other invertebrates. Social behaving, they nest in a depression on the ground. Of course, they are ground nesting bird. They're in open countryside. That's the only place they can nest. It's selected by the female and attended by the male, and the male gets sort of watched as the female gets watched as she selects the site. And it's built by the female in 5 to 7 days, 3 to 5 days. Which is remarkably fast. You know, nest building things, an awful lot more to it than meets the eye. And incubation is by the male, and you know, I didn't know that until I looked that up for this presentation. I had no idea that they swapped over, but both parents actually feed the young. I do like the cultural links, and I'll go into this one a little bit more detail because one of my great fan of John Clare, the English poet, who wasn't a romantic poet in the same way as the Keats and Wordsworth. He knew his stuff from the ground level. He wasn't passing on other people's information. When he wrote about a lark's nest, he wrote, "Her eggs were 4 of dusky hue, blotched brown as is the very ground, with tinges of a purply blue, the larger ends encircled round." So I looked up and found a picture, not mine, of a skylark's nest. Now just look at what John Clare wrote, and then look at this. Perfect description. He's got the colour right. He's got all the blotching at one end. And he went on to describe the nest material. The poem is much longer than that, of course. So very good, real country observation from John Clare. Hunting of skylarks, traditionally they were hunted for food, priced at a penny in 1274, 4p by 1512, 10p by inflation went on 10p by 1633, 12 skylarks equal a mallard, and 100 equaled a crane or a bustard in currency. It's strange currency. I'm not sure what date that was. And they were caught by scaring them into nets at night. Big trade in catching skylarks, or they dragged the nets across the field at night, and often they were accompanied by bells on their trousers. Skylark trappers would often wear bells, or lark mirrors were also used to reflect the light. And for a time, I had in my possession a lark trap that had been brought into the lodge, to the RSPB, by a Bedfordshire farmer who had found it in a barn years ago where they caught skylarks on the fields around here. In Victorian England, skylarks were taken for both food and cage birds. In 1830, the Halles market in Paris, over 1 million larks were sold each year. 1854, the number was 400,000 in the London markets. 1912, the RSPB drew attention to 1.5 tons of skylarks transported from the Royston to London in a week. However, the tide changed, legislation started to change, public perception started to change, and by 1914, the Albemarle Club in West End took skylarks off their menu as a gesture towards conservation. In 1923, Selfridges would only supply skylarks to contract; they weren't on open sale, and so gradually the fashion for eating skylarks died out. But we criticised the French for eating larks and things, but actually we were doing it here in England. Well, say not long ago, well, in our parents' lifetime anyway. Trend, look at this, huge downward trend of skylark. The threats to conservation, agriculture intensification, change from spring and autumn sowing of cereals have been the main cause, reduced winter survival due to the loss of winter stubble. A decrease in cereals. Again, there was less stubble for them in winter. Less favourable crops are being grown, and there's more oilseed rape, which is not nearly so good for them. And we finished Skylark. Sorry, we're drifting on into Avocet, but there's a lot more. There's a lot on that. We think a small brown bird, and there it is. Now I'm going to run over my half hour first time because this is a bit of a longer first half. But we're going to Avocets. The quick story of Avocets. Here's one in case you didn't know what it looked like. Bit from the book, amber, not red, not green, but it's halfway. Doing quite well, breeding population about 1900, but wintering population much larger at 8,700 because we get both not young birds of the year and also probably some from Holland as well. And the oldest I've got on record is 27 years, which is surprising. These are typical Avocets doing what Avocets do, sweeping their bill through the mud and standing looking like an Avocet. In flight, we've got a bit of clear here. Very repetitive, typical wader. When I hear that, I know, oh, I should know what that is, and it takes me ages. I have to cut out other things and think by exclusion I get to eventually Avocet. What do we know about Avocets? Logo of the RSPB, come to that a bit more in a minute, but we only get the head. Once the bird was only coastal. Now some, not many, breed inland. It's a conservation success story. Here they are in winter, relatively small number of sites, getting more numerous. This is now quite an old map. I think it's increased. That was the last National Atlas. Look in summer, a few more, a little bit further, more northerly sites where they breed, and also this a small number, but nevertheless a presence inland in a few suitable places, Oozewashes being one which has been populated. So it seems to be a species that's doing quite well. Conservation value, looking across the world, there are a lot of them. They go across into Asia, they go down to Africa, but often as a wintering species, and they're even in India, in the Indian subcontinent, as a wintering species. They're very aggressive, actually. They're aggressive towards each other. Here are two probably males, actually may not be, maybe females, sparring with each other because they've got young nearby, very aggressive when they've got young nearby. And I think it was the same bird that was here. It's a very funny action picture, but it's actually going for a mallard, female mallard, strayed into its territory where its young were, and gosh, the Avocet went for it. So they really are very good at defending their territories. These Avocets, I like this picture. They all look at RSPB, little line of RSPB logos there. And when you look at the picture, there they are. You see, look, Robert Gilmore's just caught. He designed the Avocet logo. There was an earlier one which looked like a very sad Avocet sitting in a puddle. But about 1969, 1970, Robert Gilmore decided to draw a more streamlined one. And that was the Avocet logo until this one, which you'll recognize. Well, no, of course it's changed now. It's gone. It's gone. But anyway, this was the one until recently. And the reason it had its head cut off was for road signs. It was the introduction of the highways brown signs, which allowed organizations, and RSPB was allowed to be one of the few, National Trust was one of the few others, to have their own logo on the sign, but that just didn't work on a road sign. It was too big, it was too flimsy. That was much more positive, and that was much better. And there it is in action. Return of the Avocet, lost as a breeding bird in Victorian times, returned during World War II, first recorded breeding again after the war in 1947, first at Minsmere, which had been flooded at that time to prevent invasion, coastal defences. Much of East Anglia went underwater. Also at Havogate, an island near Alford, which still became the centre of Avocets for a long time afterwards. Fascinating story, haven't got time for it, but two brothers, both Stamford brothers, both from the military. One was a lieutenant colonel, one was a brigadier. One found them at Minsmere, one found them at Havogate, and they passionately protected their birds and didn't let anybody know they were there. They were determined that these birds would survive. The story goes, and they didn't even tell each other. So it must have been an interesting discussion when they got together and said, "I've been protecting Minsmere avocets," and the other one saying, "Oh, funny that I've been protecting them at Havergate." Anyway, there's a making of a play in that. And then gradually they've spread along the coast to other sites and to a few other inland sites. Threats now, rising water levels, more from summer rain than coastal flooding, but always a possibility. They're more in lagoons rather than on the beaches. Ground predators are a huge problem. Fox, hedgerow, stoat, badger, all have been recorded taking avocets. Avian predators like gulls and crows and some of the birds of prey. Kestrel is another one that does. And disturbance by humans, especially on new sites, is a real problem. And habitat loss. There aren't perhaps as many of those coastal sites undisturbed there as there were in the past. So with that, we're going to, and some nice pictures of avocets just to finish this first half. When you find a flock of it like this on a winter day, on a British estuary, south and southern half of Britain, that you really feel good. These are wonderful birds to have back in these sort of numbers now, not just ones or two, but to have a flock of avocets stream past you like this is a real privilege. So we'll move on straight away to Moorhen, really different, perhaps overlooked bird. I think this is a real benefit in having this one in there for a change. Here it is. What do we know about it? Well, it's green. There's no danger with Moorhen at the moment, we hope. You can have 2 or 3 broods a year, so it can be quite prolific. And again, we've got a record of an oldest bird getting to 18 years old. So all looks pretty good on that front, but they are still quite interesting. Don't ignore moorhens because identification, well, they're pretty easy. The red and black bill is the red and yellow bill is what most people remember, and perhaps the yellow legs and see it as a black bird. It's only when you see it really close up in good light you realize it's not really just black. Very hard to describe the sort of plum. It's like a sloe berry, the color of it. So the breast and front half, and the back is brown, but it's almost sort of olive brown. It's got a sort of tinge to it. Here's another one, and it shows the contrast between the two colors. So it's not quite as uniformly dark colored as you might initially think. The juveniles are brown, and this one's getting some of the flank markings of the adult, and behind it is a chick or a downy youngster. So you've actually got 2 generations of young birds there, both of which can be around in the same summer. They're both at the same time, obviously, in the picture. The little ones start off by looking like little fluffy balls of black fur with the most ridiculous little wings, which look like paddles sticking out of either side, and are quite cute. And I'm sure you've seen those in parks and places like that. There's another one. I like taking moorhen chicks. The voice, I think I've got a recording of voice. Let's just try this. Perhaps not. Oh, no, sorry, I haven't got. No, I haven't got recording. But I'm sure you know what moorhens sound like. This chugging that they do as they sort of chug across a lake. They always make the noise of a tugboat chugging across. Similar species, well, people do get them confused for a reason I don't really understand with coots. Coots are blackbirds, live in similar sorts of places, tend to be larger lakes, and of course the bill is really white with a really white frontal shield. So, and of course they're closely related. Also got a very red eye, which is quite cute.
Coot.
Oh, I have got a recording. Oh, here we go. Well, you know that one. But the other relative of the moorhen that gets overlooked is water rail, and they're so secretive. You hardly ever see them, but they're around. I think they're more around more in the right, particularly where there are bitterns, right, to be water rails and many other ditches and things as well. And we get a lot more come into the country during the winter. Haven't got a recording of those on here, but the recording, the call that I hear most immediately know it's water rail. They make lots of other noises which sound very much like moorhen to my ears, but the call which is theirs, which said, "Oh, there's a water rail here," sounds to me like squealing piglets. It's really weird, most out of keeping with a reed bed. So once you hear that, you know you've got a water rail. I have got this picture of water rail making its way through the reeds, which shows it's a very, very slim bird. Moorhens tend to be quite fat, and so do coots, but these are really slimmed down, ready for their life, moving between the reed beds. Behaviour of moorhens, remember we were talking about moorhens here, they will sometimes dive to avoid danger. And I'm going to show you that in a minute. They're sometimes aggressive to other moorhens. Going to show you that. Oh, yes. So I did capture on a film this moorhen, which I don't know really what it was doing. I think it had found some food a bit too deep down to be able to reach, and it kept on splashing down and completely disappearing below the surface. I've never seen a moorhen do that before, and I was just lucky to have my camera on fast shutter speed and capture it go. As I say, not much of a story because I don't know why it was doing it. But the other thing I did capture, I think it may be the same day, was a fight between two moorhens, and they really are aggressive. Look at these two really having a go at each other. It's not easy to think of other examples, but a coot, I suppose, is one, but where the same species of birds really regularly fight each other. But these two are really using their feet. Look, these long toes and claws, and there we are. This one's pushing one over on its back. Really dramatic stuff. Ah, yeah, you wouldn't like to be on the wrong side of those claws. They do look like talons. Distribution in the UK, well distributed in lowland Britain. There it is, all lowland places, but well away from any upland areas, not surprisingly. It does need calm or still waters, doesn't want fast flowing rivers or streams very much, although farm ponds will often do for it. Across the world, and there are gallinules closely related in Americas as well, it's very well spread right across Europe, Asia, and into Africa, and resident over much of its range. The purple is the resident, the tangerine is the migratory ones. Habitat around lakes and rivers in lowland Britain, of course, ditches and small ponds, parks with ponds, classic in London, of course. Also farmland with wet ditches or ponds. May have suffered on farmlands in Britain because of so many farm ponds have disappeared. Diet tends to be feeds on land and in the water, so it's quite omnivorous really. It's plants such as duckweed, pondweed, seeds from buttercups and sedges and docks, berries even, animal matter such as worms, snails, spiders, insects, also small fish, eggs and other birds. No, yeah, just hang on to that. Small fish and eggs of other birds. Yes, it is a bit of a predator on other avian species. Here's one doing what moorhens do. I don't know why I put that picture in. Social behaviour is quite interesting. Male and female both build a nest, or sometimes it's off the ground, even in a small tree, shrub near the water. And occasionally 2 or 4 females will share one nest. And it's not unknown for one female to lay her eggs in a nest of another female and clear off and leave the first one to look after it. So they even do a bit of a cuckooing, but only on their own species. The young of the moorhen will help feed younger chicks. And this is very curious. I can only think of one other British species where this is a regular occurrence. And I did manage to get a photograph of it. This was a Slimbridge, I think. And here's a juvenile with a chick. And it's obviously not its chick because it's too young to breed. So it's adopted one of its siblings, and the sibling appears to be begging for food and as far as I could see from that picture, it's getting it. So the juvenile is feeding its younger offspring, or the younger offspring of the family, younger sibling. Migration is mostly resident, of course, but some continental birds arrive in Britain in the autumn. And this is a BTO map showing some of the places where moorhens from those parts of Western Europe have been seen in Britain, or ones from Britain have been turned up. So that's the sort of area where there is some sort of movement. It's across the bottom end of the North Sea. But I guess the Danish birds probably don't come straight from Denmark, more likely to come down the coast and then cross the North Sea where it's a bit shallower, a bit narrower, not shallow. So there's our moorhen, looking pretty spiffing in its not black plumage. That one's a particularly smart bird. Oh, cultural links, alternative names. I did dig up a few others. Cuddy, kittycoot, moorcoot, marsh hen, moorcock, and pond hen, and skitty. Skitties are lovely. The way they skittle across the water with their dragging their feet, I think that's a particularly good descriptive name. However, it's also on the or was traditionally on the gamekeeper's list of vermin, simply because of that habit of eating other birds' eggs. How common that was, I don't know, but it was enough to it to appear on gamekeepers' gibbets in the past. Moving on to linnet. Is our cock linnet on a branch. We'll have a look at a bit of linnet. We're now dealing with a red data species with a moderate decline. Again, it can have 2 or 3 broods a year, so no reason why it shouldn't be productive. And I have got a record of a bird surviving for 9 years. Not all do that, but it is possible. Identification, I think it can be a tricky bird. Something like this, you could be excused for not recognizing it. It's a bit of a brown LBJ, really. This is a brown job. And I'd be struggling with linnet on that one. Not so bad on that one, but probably more by disqualifying other species, thinking, what could it be? It's probably not that. Oh, it's probably going to be a linnet, simply by the little squishy beak, little cone-shaped beak, buff underparts, not really like a dunnock at all, something you might confuse it with, and it's not a warbler, you get there by elimination. However, when you get a male, so it's not a very bright picture, I've got better than that. Anyway, with a splash of red on its breast, a splash of red on its forehead, and then it becomes quite distinctive. Here's a male perched up, and a few things. I've actually put some arrows. That white flash in the wing shows up quite well. It shows up in flight, even shows up perched. That's a good distinctive point. Grey on the back of the neck, that shows up quite well. The pale underparts, they show up, and the white outer tail feathers in flight and even when perched, particularly in flight, or you see it taking off. You see those. Got a bit of song. Here we go. There are house sparrows in this recording as well in the background. It's a difficult song to describe. That it's I can only come to sort of twittering, but that doesn't even do it justice. There are similar species. We'll talk about the song again in a moment. Other species that look a bit like it might be redpoll, also with red on their heads, and but very deeply forked tails, and of course not nearly so common. And in Scotland, it doesn't overlap in its range very much, but twite is the mountain linnet, common in the uplands and over in the Western Isles. In fact, we look at the habitats. Habitat of linnet is thick hedgerows, heathland, wasteland and scrubby areas, coastal margins, country gardens, and feeds on coastal marshes in winter. And this is the typical place for linnet, a good series of gorse bushes, a heathland with lots of gorse, and that's where you find your linnet. And there's a nice male linnet perched up on the gorse. Another one perched up, that time on bramble. Distribution in the UK, a pretty, well, again, lowland Britain, not anywhere touching the uplands, because that's where you get your twite, at least in the northwest. That's North Scotland and northwards, North Scotland. The diet, mainly seeds, fat hen and chickweed, also seeds of dandelion and buttercup. Increasingly, it's eating oilseed rape, which is perhaps one of the reasons it's not declining quite so much. And some insects are eaten in summer, particularly the young are fed on insects. So here's our female linnet. Distribution in the world is pretty widespread. Again, it goes across Europe and into Asia. Not as far down as India, only just touching the north coast of Africa. Some of that is a winter visitor. Another one. Social behaviour and breeding. Well, the birds travel around in small flocks outside the breeding season. Larger flocks of 100 birds may form in winter. And it nests in loose colonies. So where you get one, you often get others. I get the feeling they're doing better now, but I'll show you a bit more in a minute. Nesting starts quite early in the season. And the evergreen gorse bushes and other evergreen shrubs provide cover for these early nests, which is the reason it can start earlier. More pictures. Migration, again, a lot of movement outside of Britain, even British linnets going abroad or foreign linnets coming into Britain. So movement to the continent, probably UK ones going down into France and into Spain, even getting quite well down into Spain. So quite a lot of movement with linnet. Threats and conservation has been a rapid decline since the 1970s and 80s, followed by a period of stability. Failure at egg stage has resulted in poor breeding. I'll show you that in a minute. Reduction in breeding season and food available is probably due to agricultural intensification. We'll get to that again in a moment, I think. Reduction in number of breeding attempts is something. Increasing oilseed rape may have assisted the linnets. That's unusual with them. So it's really the same as the skylark, is that a big change in the countryside in arable agriculture in the 1970s and 80s, when it became the norm to sow the cereal crops in autumn and not in spring. Huge change, because up to that point you harvested in autumn, you left the fields fallowed, you had stubble for much of the autumn and winter, and then you ploughed in your stubble, and then you planted for the spring and summer. And therefore you had lots of areas to feed on, which were full of weed and seed and things for the winter, autumn and winter. By doing all your ploughing earlier and sowing earlier, the new cereal crops started to grow in the autumn. They provided were not nearly such a valuable habitat for wintering birds, and it made it also much more difficult for ground nesting birds to nest, things like skylarks, lapwings, and so on, because the cereal crops were growing up much quicker and much earlier, and linnet suffered from that because of the loss of probably winter food as well. And it may be that they're coming back partly because of climate change, but we'll see that in a minute. Not much sign of an increase on this. This is up to 2019, but you can see this big decline in the countryside of linnet from about the mid-1960s, and then bouncing along a much lower line since the 1990s, and not much sign yet of a recovery, although I think there is indication there are more being seen in the last couple of years. Cultural links, of course. I should have got a bit of music here. What about our old cock linnet? And there's a lot of truth in all that, and a lot of truth in this cartoon as well. So our cultural links are, well, the linnet comes from the French from linnet, from its liking for flax seeds. Old scientific name is cannabis, which is actually cannabis or hemp seed mariana. So lots of link with small seeds. But popular as a cage bird, along with goldfinch and nightingale, right back into history. And it was often said that, actually I've got chaffinch there, but often said linnet was one of the best songsters. No, not chaffinch. Why is it put chaffinch? Anyway, sorry, ignore that. Linnet was thought to be one of the best songsters. I don't see it myself, but people wax lyrical about the song of the linnet, and you heard it just now. And so much so, there was a wild bird market in East End of London, was always known for its love of small birds. There were bird clubs going on. There were sales of birds in markets. Birds were traded in East End pubs. And it's said that this cultural love of small birds, and particularly linnets, probably came from the Huguenot silk workers who were living in that area. And thousands of birds changed hands, and the trade continued in local pubs into the 1980s, and I think probably still does. There are bona fide bird clubs still in those areas, competing, having competitions for the best looking birds. But I found online this a couple of years ago during lockdown, I was just digging around and I found this picture of a linnet for sale, and for £50. So there is still a market in these small birds. Grey heron with not much time to go. Green for heron. It's not in danger particularly, though I'll show it's not doing that well. Nests very early in the year, starts in February, goes on until June, but it can be nesting almost at the end of January. And I've got a record of an oldest bird surviving for 37 years. Identification, I'm sure it doesn't need much help on that. Very spiky looking bird, this particular one, with those wonderful plumes in addition to its plumage. Ordinary feathering rather, or wispy plumes there. The bill is usually yellow, but during the breeding season, the base of the bill goes pink. And you can see this quite well if you can see the bird close up. And you should be able to see the bird quite close up in London because they are remarkably tame. This is Regent's Park. I got my best heron photographs there, and you could really see what state the breeding was. And people were just walking past this bird along the path, and you've probably done this as well. The habitats they like were shallow water, inland or coastal. Towns, they loved going in, even gardens if there are, I don't know why, but young herons seem to go into gardens to go after goldfish. I don't know why it's young herons. They seem to learn it very quickly. They're common in rural settings, but it does always need trees for nesting, although in some places, not many, it will nest on the ground, perhaps in reed beds or on cliff ledges. Again, quite rare, but it does happen. Photograph of heron. Food, of course, includes fish, generally, fish, including goldfish from garden ponds, I'm afraid. Nearer the coast, it's likely to eat eels and crabs. But opportunistically, it will eat a lot of other things as well. So small mammals, birds, amphibians, insects even are recorded as taken by herons. This is a photograph I took in Bedford, and there's a heron just having caught a fish. And I managed to zoom up on that, and you can actually see it's a pike. Look at that, quite a big pike as well. I was really quite interested to zoom up, the magic of digital photography. And this is in Regent's Park, well, maybe St James's, certainly London. That bird has got something. I couldn't work out what it was, but again, I can zoom up, it'd be out of focus. And there we are, it's a worm. So I've got a record of herons eating worms. It's not in many books, but it got one. Nest building, as I say, starts very early in the year, can start repairing the nests in January, ready for starting to lay eggs in February. Good, because we can see them at that time, and the extra leaves aren't on the trees. This is typical heronry. This is Regent's Park, one of the good places for seeing herons close up. There's one on a nest, and here's another one later in the year, adult on top, and a juvenile. I haven't got any other photographs of juvenile herons. And there's one looking much more smoky, and without the distinctive black head marks of the adults. Notice branches as they walk out from the nest along the branches, but not able to fully fly. It's one of the birds in Britain that's been studied for the longest. The first surveys of herons started in 1926. They've been counted nationally across the country ever since then. And so we've got this, and there was a very consistent pattern forming of peak, trough, peak, trough, peak, trough. And those troughs all linked up with extreme cold weather. And they could all be monitored about the really bad winter weathers. Which knocks them back a bit, and then they recover gradually over a few years, and then they get another bad spell. What's been happening more recently is more worrying, because you've got the drop, and you would have started to expect another rise, and it hasn't happened yet. Now, is it starting to happen or not? What is the reason? It can't be cold winters. We haven't really had them. We have had some cold springs, so that's possible. Or could it be pollution in the rivers? I haven't seen anybody say that, but one has to consider it. And Alison did say, could I throw in Bittern? So I'm throwing in Bittern at 4 minutes past 8, 4 minutes past 9. And there we are. I've got some good pictures of Bittern to show you. I'm sure you can see that one. This is called Spot the Bittern. There we are. Can you spot that one? Or that one? Oh, that's the same one, a bit closer. I've zoomed in just so you can see it. This is Titchwell. This is a Titchwell bittern. It did come out eventually, and it tiptoed across between the reed beds, pretending it wasn't there. They are curious things. They're good fun, but very curious. And there's one. I'm sure you can see that one. Or there. See that one? It's really... You realise why people don't see bitterns. I'm standing back now and I can't really see it. Oh, there we are. It's come out in the open a bit more. And so that was my bittern collection until eventually I got one that looked like that. I'm quite pleased with that picture. So eventually one out in the open. I think that's Minsmere. Oh, no, it's Scotland. Sorry, different ways. Anyway, I have got a picture of one swimming. They can swim, or at least they go into deep water when there's some of these reed beds have got deep channels between the reeds, so they wade and go in quite deep. And that one seems to have gone in up to its wings. Short history of Bitterns. Famous painting, artist as a young man, Rembrandt. Rembrandt painting himself with a dead bittern. These Dutch do like their bitterns. And there's his Rembrandt again, as an older artist. It's called Young Girl with a Starling, this painting is called. And there on the right is another dead bittern. So Rembrandt was into painting bitterns, though he liked them dead. And I think he probably ate a lot because they're very common in Holland, or would have been at that time. In Britain, we can just cover a short history. They were once common throughout the fens of East Anglia and elsewhere. They became extinct through drainage mainly, probably overhunting as well, and extinct by 1900. Recolonization happened naturally in the 1950s, and they were well protected, but they declined to only 11 birds by 1997. Research showed that at that time, the reason for their decline, or the reason they weren't expanding from that low level, was there was a shortage of large reed beds, large healthy reed beds. RSPB and other organisations appealed to the then European Union for life funding, got a lot of money, and a lot was done to expand. Well, you've got here European funding to establish and re-establish habitats, extending existing reed beds, or even in some cases planting new ones on old gravel workings and places like that. And you've got Ouse Valley, Ouse Fen, and places like that, which came about at that time, which have now got bitterns. And now it's estimated there are 200 males. And that increases in winter to around about 800, which is probably partly the offspring, and probably we get some coming to us from Europe. Holland isn't far away, and they're still quite numerous in the reed beds and polders of Holland. So, with a picture of definitely a Minsmere bittern, I will leave you for this evening.